Good afternoon, good evening. I would like to say good morning to some people, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet with our international reach. But 2025 is a new dawn. And Happy New Year for everyone whose last go round was our final webinar of 2024. I want to thank you all for making 24 definitely the most diverse topic wise, the most dense information wise, and I can probably speak for everyone in the company, the most satisfying from an education perspective, because every chance we get to educate everyone here, not only do we get better ourselves, but hopefully we're passing along information that's resonating and being useful in terms of its guidance or its action, call to action specifically, to help all of you help yourselves, your families, and your clients. We thought about doing this topic last year. It was briefly mentioned, and full disclosure, I've packed so much in here today. I'm going to try to do my justice to give you all a really good crash course, so to speak, of a postbiotics 101, because going into this, I had a familiar knowledge of postbiotics, but doing the research to put these slides together, this area of influence when it comes to the gut microbiome and gut health and overall systemic health is rather remarkable. And that's why I'm calling this one Postbiotics, Currencies of Communication, because you realize there is a really rich, engaging, and vast world that lives inside of each one of us. We have trillions of bacteria that take up residence, and just yesterday, the Master Supplements crew and I were talking about the concept of a healthy community and what underpins or dictates a healthy community. And I believe that the patterns that we see in nature, in society, from the community affect the individual. From the individual, it goes down to the organism and the organ systems, and it goes down to the tissues, the cells, and obviously down to the tiny little bacteria in each individual one and the role it plays in our overall health and wellness. And what they use in terms of their way to communicate with us are these series of postbiotics. So without further ado, I want to get into introducing what a postbiotic is. So here's a question for you all. No one's going to answer out loud, of course, that I can hear, but I'm going to pretend that you are. What do you get when you add a prebiotic with a probiotic? If you said postbiotic, it's not the answer. The answer is a symbiotic. So in a perfect world, a healthy prebiotic in the form of some indigestible carbohydrate marries with a probiotic or a series of probiotics, and that's a symbiotic relationship. However, there's a second part to the question. What is the outcome of a probiotic being acted upon by, sorry, a prebiotic being acted on by a probiotic? It's a better way to ask the question. And yes, I was trying to deceive all of you. This is what a postbiotic is. And today I want to uncover, I think, the least well-known metabolites of influence within the microbiome. So we're all now going to look like this for a moment to think, oh, Roland, that was really funny. Please don't quit your day job as stand-up comedy. I promise you I only do it on weekends and I do it for free. So postbiotics are very interesting molecules because they're considered functionally bioactive molecules generated during microbial fermentation of food in the gastrointestinal tract. It's a very fancy way for saying that various compounds that come into our guts via the food we eat, the beverages we drink, and the supplements we take, if the body is not able to break them down and absorb them, then they become a potential food for being acted upon by the different microbial communities within our gut. The difference in their effects and composition lies with the extent of microbial metabolization of a diverse food matrix. Therefore, the term postbiotics is really an umbrella term for essentially anything that is microbially fermented. The end product of such is a postbiotic. So it could be a prebiotic fiber, it could be a protein, it could be an amino acid that's acted upon by a microbe. It doesn't really matter what the starting aspect or the starting molecule is, the end result is a postbiotic. And because this field is ever expanding, it's actually quite a new field of research that has actually only really been elucidated and deeply delved into since probably somewhere in the early to mid 90s. Several researchers, and it's still not uniformly agreed upon, recommend different terminologies to describe probiotic effector molecules like metabolites, ghost probiotics, which are essentially the information of a probiotic that is no longer alive, inactive probiotics, non-viable probiotics, dead bacterial cells and DNA, And there are different kinds of parabiotics, pseudoprobiotics. There's even things called psychobiotics. So this is a very rapidly expanding field of research that has really two main targets: drug alternatives and therapies in the natural sense. The medical industry is trying to use these as some targets for pharmaceuticals. And believe it or not, the food and the pharmaceutical makeup industry is looking at some of these things as end products to be consumer goods. So, who knew that the little microbial metabolites of what our bacteria break down could actually be something that benefit the food that we have in our fridge or the makeup and the personal care products that we put on our skin? So it's really important to remember that a postbiotic is not one single thing. It's actually one category. And within those categories, you see a variety of different things. What you see right here are the most common categories of postbiotics, which we'll get into. So vitamin cofactors, most people don't remember that our microbiome and the microbiota specifically can generate B vitamins for us. Sometimes they create things like lipids, short chain fatty acids. Sometimes they'll use old bacterial fragments and cells as a way to communicate with the immune system. Carbohydrates and proteins can be enzymatically converted into bioactive molecules, and things like organic acids and other complex molecules can be used to signal the immune system, signal the epithelial cells specifically, or used as a way to talk to other microbial communities within the gut. So it's a really important thing to understand that this is a vast, vast series of molecules. And what I've underlined in the bottom there, the important thing is they all have to have a biological activity within the host, us. And the long and short of it is these postbiotics are generated to create a better environment for the microbes to inhabit, and thus a better environment to help us, the host, be supportive of the environment that those microbes inhabit. So now that we have the whole understanding, the term biotic is actually very interesting. I have a cool definition coming up, but it's important to understand where these things are placed. The challenging part is to understand the nature of, does a prebiotic plus a probiotic specifically dictate or generate a postbiotic that we can understand or measure? In some cases, yes. Next month, we're actually going to get into breaking down and assessing some lab work to understand from these postbiotic molecules that we're elucidating, can we do anything about them in terms of understanding what may be going on within the deeper aspects of our digestive system? And specifically, if someone's dealing with issues in their gut, are there signs and patterns of postbiotic evidence that you can look at in the stool and in the urine of an organic acids test or a stool test? But understanding where the categories are, all prebiotics have to be either some sort of food sourced fiber or indigestible carbohydrate. A probiotic, well, that one's easy. We've been talking about these for years. This is a live bacteria as part of a family, as part of a network that work in concert with us, the host, to help process things for the benefits of both involved. Now you know that the postbiotic is the outcome of the probiotic acting upon the prebiotic, and therefore the symbiotic is actually the mix of the first two. So the word biotic is the word of the day, and it's the thing that I hope you take away from. And it's an important thing to understand that the concept of the influence and the interaction points between these four are super important for early life development in terms of the development of a healthy microbiome, a healthy digestive tract, the specific colonies and families of the microbes that that baby is essentially given at birth and developed through the first few years of life very rapidly, and ultimately the health of the immune system and the ability of the immune system to both keep us healthy and fight off infections but not become over agitated and aberrant is very much indicated by the early life dynamics of these four divisions of biotics. And another quick plug, that's going to be something we're going to be getting into come March, where we're going to do pediatrics and probiotics. So there's a lot to come this year that this topic really very nicely has become somewhat of a jumping off point for. So how do you make a postbiotic? Well, here's a little recipe card that I created. Well, I found a nice graphic and I created my own. So it starts with a digestive system, just like the master philosophy. In order to break things down and absorb them properly, we need strong digestive function. And in order to not overfeed a part of the gut, specifically the colon, where most of the probiotic bacteria live, with an abundant assortment of molecules that are undigested, we want to make sure that we have strong digestive organ function. we have an optimal aspect of food selection. And when it comes to probiotic cultures in the gut, the concept of diversity is an important thing a lot of people talk about. And diversity doesn't end just with microbes. Diversity comes from the food selection that you include in your diet, both daily and in terms of a seasonal aspect, because our guts like the weather outside of us. It's really cold down here unseasonably today, but we're in a winter phase. So what grows in winter? Not much. It's probably a time for the regeneration of the microbiome, having exposure to less food or very specific kinds of foods in the winter. And those combinations of things ultimately create the healthy terrain. And a healthy terrain is what's needed to house a healthy microbe profile. So then when we get into the microbes, we have to have A, optimal microbial diversity, which is unique to the person. We have to house those microbes in an optimal environment. So we need to make sure that we have a strong, healthy bilipid mucosal layer. And then the third thing is an optimal community makeup. So that's where the first things really help shape the dynamic terrain of the microbiome, making sure that we have all of our commensal species in an optimal range to where no pathogens can proliferate. And then we have that community dynamic that I mentioned before, where all the species are working together in concert to make a healthy environment for us. This is where the third aspect happens. This is where the bacterial fermentation takes place. So we need to make sure that we're feeding the adequate kinds of foods and the substrates for the specific keystone species to break down things like the bifidobacterium, the lactobacillus, the fecalum, the akkermansia. But we also need to make sure that we're maintaining an optimal pH, which again starts with the digestive function, because enzymes are pH dependent and certain species of bacteria can only thrive in certain pH conditions, which is a good thing if we're keeping an optimal pH to crowd out pathogens. But in the case of something like excessively alkaline pH in the digestive system, bacterial fermentation slows down. So not only do we not get the postbiotics that we need, but we likely also create the terrain that's able to house things like parasites, fungi, infestations, and so on. So in an optimal scenario, you have A, B, C, and this equals the synthesis of various compounds that broadly influence the microbiome. But in addition to that, the nervous system, because we have a very comprehensive nervous system in our guts, the immune system, which they say 60 to 70% of immune cells reside within our gut, and systemic metabolic function, because what happens metabolically in the gut has a systemic effect on our entire metabolism in terms of how efficiently our body turns food into energy and how we can use that energy in the presence of oxygen to make ATP and keep our bodies healthy. So now that you have that understanding of the formula of creating postbiotics, we then have to further delineate into the two different components of postbiotics. As I said before, one category of postbiotics are actually things that are bacterial fragments themselves. So they can be intact, inanimate microbial cells, meaning they can be old, dead bacteria that are essentially sloughing off of where they've adhered to the mucosal lining, and these can be signaling molecules to influence some aspects of either microbiome or immune function. They can also be fragments of cells, things like LPS, which we've talked about. There's also another polysaccharide called EPS, and these things can be signals to the immune system based upon if excessive species of bacteria are dying. It's an indication that there's a change in the internal environment. So the first two are driven mostly by bacterial residence and anything that you do that modulates bacterial populations. The third aspects are the microbial metabolic end products that are either broken down or converted by microbes acting upon precursors. And these are mostly driven by what we eat from a dietary perspective and also what we take in from a gut specific supplementation perspective. So if we're taking some sort of insoluble fiber versus a soluble fiber, if we're taking some kind of short chain fatty acid supplement, they will influence the populations of bacteria that grow and thus what is being acted upon by what it is we eat. So the whole aspect is, this is the important takeaway, if our postbiotic generation is optimal because we have a healthy gut lining, we have a healthy microbial community, the benefit is what happens in the gut multiplies itself as a pattern in the rest of the body. So if this barrier is optimally maintained, if we have an optimal design and communication within our microbiome, generally speaking, we see that those people who have this pattern are healthier people. And most of us here are probably trying to help people through their gut health. So we can assume that the inverse is true. If the postbiotics that we need to help maintain adequate immune function, strong barrier function in the form of maintaining tight junctions and preventing leaky gut, making sure that we don't have excessive breakdown of our mucosal layer, then we're going to have an environment inside that is going to be deemed pro-inflammatory and immunocompromised. These people are going to be the ones that generate a lot of the symptoms that we see, ultimately the ones that have the results of their functional medicine tests come back less than optimal. So this is a really interesting area of thinking how to affect things like autoimmunity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, brain fog, neurodegenerative diseases. This is where when people say, oh, what happens in the gut can help people with such and such condition, this is starting to tell the story of how those mechanisms of action take place. And although we're in the new days of understanding this, I think understanding the pattern is at least going to prime your ability to be prepared for when more research and more testing elucidates more practical avenues of exploration. You'll be able to understand and draw connections between certain fiber supplementation helping people with certain conditions, or using certain kind of probiotic species with certain kinds of changes in therapeutic diets, and how that may remediate or slow down the development of a potentially chronic condition. I think it's really exciting. And here's something that I learned in my studies that I wanted to share with everyone. So the word biotics is actually derived from a Greek term that means pertaining to life. So if you think about this, pertaining to life makes the whole aspect of Hippocrates, all disease starts in the gut, a lot more impactful, don't you think? Because the presence of living organisms in a biological ecosystem connected to their physical environment is literally the explanation of why having a healthy gut helps make a healthier human. The term biotics, when we use it in a more modern sense, is more so connected towards the adoption of various nutritional strategies that favor the modulation of gut microbiota, attaining towards the health status of a host. So, in a weird way, they're saying the same thing, one a little bit more narrow in its concept and one a lot more broad. But both of these things allow me to reinforce my belief and the understanding and the desire to communicate this to all of you that what happens in the gut has a positive or a negative effect on everything systemically. And as a clinician, your skillful use of your biotics, your prebiotics, your probiotics, in addition to dietary and lifestyle strategies, are going to be the things that hopefully, when you align all of those variables optimally, you can create healthful postbiotics, which can be a major aspect of influence for someone who has had long suffering digestive illnesses. And I think the idea of autoimmune irritable bowel conditions, Crohn's, and the various forms of colitis is a major area of opportunity for such things, as are neurodegenerative conditions and also things like autism spectrum disorder, because it's also the gateway into improving one's overall health from a systemic holistic perspective. So I did say postbiotics were a fairly new elucidation within the world of microbiology and gut health. And here it is. The developments in postbiotics actually started the year I was born, 1986. And there's been an evolution of understanding what they were. Um, the key thing to remember, as I said before, a postbiotic by definition should confer a beneficial effect within the host and microbiome specifically. And there are some times where a postbiotic, when out of whack, can actually throw the whole thing off in terms of a homeostasis within the gut. An example could be an imbalance in the production of short chain fatty acids, or potentially high amounts of hydrogen, or the conversion of hydrogen to hydrogen sulfide from microbial origins can be problematic for some people. But the long and short of it is this is a brand new area. And if they're looking at the things that have been developed, the original postbiotics were actually physical things, as I mentioned. And now we're looking at things that are metabolites that you find in other areas in the body. So not only things like short chain fatty acids, but GABA, that's a neurotransmitter found in the brain. Things like histamines, and they're looking at how these bioactive molecules can affect all different kinds of areas in the body, specifically in relation to anti-inflammatory or attenuating effects for chronic degenerative conditions. This one we know really well, and we've often talked about the idea that the gut whatever axis, the gut lung axis, the gut brain axis, the gut metabolic axis, have these strong connections of bidirectional communication. When you start diving deeper, the next layer down is understanding that people with certain strains or species of bacteria in their guts typically have healthier metabolic function, lower occurrences of cardiovascular disease, lower likelihoods of developing neurodegenerative conditions. But it's really not just the bacteria. It's what these little bacterial things can do to maintain homeostasis within the digestive system so the breakdown of the gut barrier does not unnaturally or artificially speed up the degradation of some of these body systems. Because we know that what's going on in the gut for some people can result in asthma based upon taking an antibiotic and generating a new profile to the gut microbiome. We know that people who have issues with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, have a very specific profile of gut microbes that healthy people do not. We know that people who have susceptibilities to innate or adaptive immune conditions that result in autoimmune presentations typically have certain microbial ecologies that are present that other people don't. So if you take this one layer deeper into the world of postbiotics, I think it's really the communication between the microbes and the immune system at the level of the gut that is influencing the ability for these microbes to either preferentially or detrimentally affect other body systems. So let's look at how some of these things happen. We know that dietary fiber is important and not all fibers are created equally. And the one interesting thing about humans in terms of their enzymatic production is we do not have the ability to break fiber down to extract any calories from it. There's no nutrition for us specifically when it comes to eating fiber. So we've always been told that fiber is good for the gut. Well, as time has gone on, we've elucidated that most prebiotic fibers, which all prebiotic fibers are soluble fibers, can be broken down by microbes into these small little 2, 3, and 4 carbon fats called short chain fatty acids. So the fiber that we feed our microbes ends up being a preferential source of food for not only the microbes, but they generate the food for the cells in our digestive lining to stay healthy. So the enterocytes in the gut preferentially want to create food from butyrate, acetate, and propionate. What's even more interesting is once the gut has utilized all of these fuels, once it has consumed as many short chain fatty acids and made as much ATP as possible, some of these short chain fatty acids can actually get through the gut lining, enter the circulatory system, get transported to the liver, and the liver and other tissues can use these short chain fatty acids for two ways. One, they are actually forms of energy that the body can very easily convert into ATP. But two, these molecules are signaling molecules that can influence the outcome of an inflammatory insult or down or upregulate metabolic function and reduce reactive oxygen species. So all of this from the connection point of fiber being the preferential source of prebiotics for microbes that generate postbiotics to create fuel for our gut that then signal the rest of our body to improve the metabolic efficiency of how our body makes energy. I think that's absolutely incredible. There's another one. When we're looking at the breakdown, the interplay of these postbiotic metabolites, short chain fatty acids, like I mentioned before, not only act as a fuel source, but they're a fatty acid. They're an acidifying ingredient. And the generation of higher amounts of short chain fatty acids influences the pH locally in the gut environment to influence and improve the secretion of mucus to make sure that our epithelial cells are protected. But having a lower pH actually potentially prevents things like viral infections and pathogen infections because the acidic pH inactivates the enzymes that these viruses and pathogens use to make fuel and energy for themselves and to adhere to the epithelial lining. So that's where we can also use things like antimicrobial peptides and bacteriocins. These are protein and amino based molecules that get generated by probiotics as postbiotics to basically help protect the local environment from infection. These microbes can also take single amino acids and convert them into neurotransmitters that can actually signal the enteric nervous system. And everything that seemingly these probiotics are trying to make from a postbiotic perspective The number one priority is to protect and maintain the integrity of the gut barrier because the body knows that the minute things from our digestive system have the ability to get out into general circulation, bacteria, fungal things, viruses, toxins, anything that gets into the circulatory systems can settle in different areas of the body, different organ systems, different tissues, different cells. And if they're not meant to be there, they can start and initiate the inflammatory insult that I believe precipitates the development of chronic degenerative conditions. So I think these things are absolutely incredible. And if you want a quick and dirty, so to speak, of what I call the network-wide benefits of postbiotic activity, here is probably the major things, and I know I'm missing a lot because there's way more to elucidate, but antiviral inhibitory metabolites, improvement of epithelial lining and barrier function because leaky gut is absolutely rampant, the modulation of the innate and adaptive immune systems, the effect on the gut-brain axis, specifically the positive effect on the gut-brain axis via vagal nerve communication, role in the alleviation of secondary fungal infections and pathogen inhibition, and whole host metabolic effects, specifically the improvement of the body to turn food calories into energy and not store those calories on the body in the forms of adipose tissue. These things kind of sound like magic to me. I won't go through this chart, but I included this for everyone in the slides just to see the combination of different probiotic and postbiotic names and how those things are being applied, not only in the field of medicine, but in various other fields that have the ability to reap the benefits of microbial metabolization of the things that we feed them. So now that we have hopefully a great understanding of postbiotics, and I do love alliterations, now we have to understand how do you produce powerful postbiotics? No one forgets an alliteration. Well, it does really start before you even think about what your ability to break food down is. It starts with how you eat, meaning specifically, you have to choose to be mindful when you eat, and you have to eat mindfully with what it is you choose. So, what you eat, the food choices, and how you eat it really does set the tone for what happens within the gut from a digestive absorption perspective. But also, what doesn't get broken down, as I mentioned before, becomes viable food for the colon in a scenario that we actually don't want. Eating, as I've talked about this over and over again, really does require a strong parasympathetic innervation because our vagus nerve is the nerve that innervates every single organ of digestion, and our ability to produce stomach acid, bile, enzymes to move food through our system and adequately absorb food through that digestive lining is really dependent upon the gut nervous system being able to signal properly to the organs of digestion. The food we eat ultimately nourishes us and our microbes. So, having a diversity of different foods to prevent the generation of food sensitivities, a diversity of different foods to allow for the nutritional diversity of those foods to be beneficial for us. Foods that have high amounts of water soluble vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, foods rich in minerals, making sure that we're getting different kinds of amino acids and fatty acids and slow digesting carbohydrates. That's really the basis for what it is that we can do to start the ability of our guts to produce optimal postbiotics. And high fructose corn syrup, food colorings, anything in the Franken food department that comes in a package that's got a 5-year shelf life, if your clients are eating those things, they need to understand that every time you eat, you have the opportunity to help yourself or hinder yourself. And if people are struggling at this phase of digestion, making sure that you're supplementing with something like an HCl to ensure adequate protein breakdown is one of the most detrimental aspects, offenders, if you will, of probiotic overgrowth in the colon and pathogen generation is when we excessively allow undigested protein molecules to enter into the colon, because that's a feeding frenzy for certain strains of bacteria that, when overgrown and overly populate, can create an internal environment that pushes us away from health. The second thing is once you eat your food, you do need to break your food down completely. So chewing is a lost art, something that we should all probably have a class in school. Imagine that. How to eat a meal, kids. Today you're going to chew 35 times before you swallow. And what I mentioned previously, the average person who doesn't eat mindfully likely doesn't digest adequately. Our fats, proteins, and carbs all need to be broken down to their smallest potential molecule. So triglycerides into lipids, proteins into amino acids and peptides, and carbohydrates into the base sugars that we need to actually absorb. So making sure that we're supplementing with something like a digestive enzyme along the way, especially if we or our clients are showing signs and symptoms of inadequate digestion, is the best thing to do, using a digeszyme, a digeszyme plus. For those who have trouble with fat digestion, Enzalase, or our new Enzalase Pro, is now available. These can work, again, in isolation or in concert with something like an HCl to make sure that the first part of this whole thing, the eating and the breaking down of food, is taken care of, not to generate a potential issue further downstream. The third aspect is you do need certain kinds of microbes to be present. You need all of those keystone strains, which happen to be, from a postbiotic synthesis perspective, very heavily dependent upon the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterial family. And once they are there, this is where the intelligence of nature will take over, because we can't actually know in any way, shape, or form what's going on in our guts in real time from a metabolic activity perspective. The best we can do is test and see what metabolites are coming out after the fact. But even that has limitations, as every version of you is a different version each day that goes by, especially if you're making changes to your diet or to your health. So making sure that if you do have any suspected indications that you may be deficient in certain strains of bacteria, trying to encourage the growth of those with optimal diet choices and using the kinds of probiotics you want to supplement. Most companies don't think about local probiotic support. That's one of the things and the hallmarks of what I think makes this company so unique, is not only do we go as deep as possible with the functionalities of the microbes that we put in these supplements, but we focus our efforts on specific areas based upon the knowledge of what residents are primarily there. If you have small intestinal issues, you're probably not going to want to go for a bifido supplement, because knowing that most of the bifido lives in the colon is an important thing to understand when selecting a probiotic. Supplemental probiotics in many ways are part of the process. What I mean by that is, if someone has long-standing gut issues, I don't want to sell the idea that they're going to take one bottle of probiotics and everything's going to be different. In some cases, that does happen, but it's really about understanding that this is a formulaic aspect with supporting digestion and food choices. And the third thing is, if we want these microbes to be present to generate the postbiotics, if they are found to be deficient in some way or we're throwing out symptoms, we have to have some strategy in terms of how we supplement. And then we have to think about prebiotics. And this is an interesting thing, because nowadays in the food industry, prebiotics are the newest thing that are being put into everything. I had a soda today. It was one of these healthy sodas, and I was looking at the can, and it said 9 grams of fiber in the form of cassava prebiotics, inulin, and agave fructooligosaccharides. Are these things good? Are these things bad? I can't say. I think it's specific upon the individual. But what I will say is there's likely no strategy surrounding how these companies are deciding upon what to put in their foods, because these probiotics are marketing toys, marketing gimmicks. Functional probiotics and prebiotics are what we do best. So sun fiber really comes in here, because sun fiber, being a partially hydrolyzed guar gum, has the ability to support butyrate producers, which is the most important short chain fatty acid. And if you look at this molecule, or this graphic rather, the molecule that you give certain strains of bacteria have to be acted upon in the form of a team effort. So a bifidobacteria might generate lactate, and they may actually take that lactate and send it to another strain of bacteria that fully converts it into butyrate. This is why the world of prebiotics actually takes a little bit of nuance and understanding, because not all prebiotics are created equal. Sun fiber's strategic and targeted ability is they only grow the keystone strains, and they don't contribute to the ability for pathogens to feed on them like certain inulins and agaves do, because of the molecular size of the sun fiber itself. So when you're actually wanting to build microbial communities and generate postbiotics, understanding that not all prebiotics are created equal and not all fibers are necessarily feeding only the good guys, that's the next layer of it. And it's really important to understand that each kind of fiber, and this is beyond just the idea of supplemental fiber, but each kind of fiber has a specific outcome of the post metabolite that could be made. So varying the fibers in your diet as often as possible, and avoiding the things that clinically make you feel unwell or give nasty symptoms, if you've been told that chicory root's a good idea, but it makes you look like you're 5 months pregnant 4 hours after you take it, it's probably not a good fiber for you. This is where you have to figure out what you as an individual need in terms of how your supplementation and your diet strategies may go. And the last aspect, and this is what I believe is to be very true, is it's all about the terrain. We talked about this yesterday within our in our group. The germ theory is that one germ is the initiating point to cause all the chaos and havoc, whereas the terrain theory is a germ in the negative context can only be housed if the terrain is optimal for that germ. And everything in our guts take place on a biochemical level within the terrain itself. So you have to have a well-functioning mucosal layer that separates the microbes from the epithelial cells. Two, you have to have a healthy epithelial lining with optimal absorption services, with the ability to secrete various antimicrobial peptides and defenses. And you have to maintain those tight junctions because we have to remember the epithelial lining is only a single cell layer thick. Three, you have to have optimal commensal microbes. And in order for those commensals to be happy and healthy, they need to work as a team to potentially anchor that so pathogens and parasites and other things can't take over. And the last aspect is you have to have a healthy communication within all of these different pieces of the puzzle. Your immune system is mostly being directed by the information coming in from not only the microbes, but the cell lining of the digestive system itself. And you want your cellular immunity to be able to intervene when there's a problem, but you want it to be able to calm down again. And the most common pattern we see in people with autoimmune conditions and inflammatory conditions are that their immune systems have lost the ability to self-regulate, likely because along the way some injury or some insult fragmented the communication between all these different components and forever changed the gut microbes to be more propensity to upregulate inflammation and not necessarily be able to resolve and communicate with the immune system when everything is okay. So making sure that the conditions of the terrain are what dictate where this is able to happen or what is able to happen in the terrain is very important. So now we have the how to create postbiotics. We're going to finish off with knowing your postbiotics. And this is a brief little run through. The most important ones are short chain fatty acids. What's nice about short chain fatty acids is they can actually be measured to give you an indication of what might be going on metabolically inside the digestive system and also give you an indication of the kind of diet that your client is predisposing their microbes to. So the three main short chain fatty acids are acetate, 2 carbons, propionate, and butyrate, 4 carbons. And the ratios of these seem to have relevance to the health and well-being of the person. Higher levels of butyrate typically seem to be the most advantageous aspect for the microbiome, whereas higher levels of propionate typically cause some sort of metabolic dysregulation and potentially the influence or increase of the risk of things like type 2 diabetes. To generate butyrate is really to help anchor the overall health of the microbiome based upon giving the gut adequate levels of energy. And what generates adequate butyrate is diversity within the gut in terms of a microbe perspective and diversity within the diet in terms of the food that you feed those microbes. The second area, which I find probably the most interesting because it's the most like chemical warfare, are peptides, proteins, and something called a bacteriocin, which I did pronounce practicing, and I think I got it when I tried there. The microbes have their own innate sense of what I would call sense threat, meaning a commensal bacteria will know what a pathogen is, will know what a parasite is, and because the microbiome is working always as a unit, if the microbes sense that something is threatening, they will try to do whatever they can to generate their own chemical warfare to do two things. One, to potentially push out or crowd out the pathogen or annihilate it specifically, or number two, to try to recruit the immune system in having the immune system aid the microbes and potentially warding off the potential infection. So these various peptides and proteins can be used as a specific target for pathogens. Others can create what's called an inhibition of pathogen adhesion, because when a pathogen takes hold, it has to be able to bind to a site so it can sustain itself before it induces its effects. So a way that a a probiotic bacteria can help inhibit this is it can inactivate the enzymes of these bacteria pathogens to adhere based upon changing the pH locally or disrupting the biofilm. And when it comes to how it recruits the immune system, things like antimicrobial peptides, depending on the kind that are generated, but also the quantity that are generated, specifically can help influence either the innate or the adaptive immune system to upregulate things like B cells and T cells in order to help annihilate the potential infection from taking hold. And the other thing that I find very interesting is lactic acid producing bacteria also produce all the major neurotransmitters and peptides that we find in the brain locally in the gut. So when someone says the gut is the second brain, there's a lot of science to show that this statement has a lot more obvious nature than we've actually thought as a local colloquialism. Organic acids are another thing. So organic acids can be used as the basis for short chain fatty acid synthesis, or they can be used again as chemical warfare to inhibit pathogens or to specifically direct the activity of the immune system. And like short chain fatty acids, organic acids are cool in that they can be measured on specific lab tests to give us an indication of which bacterial populations may be most active, and the quantity of certain organic acids do correlate with certain conditions or certain symptoms that we can see in people based upon neurological behavior or physiologic symptom presentation. And the last thing, which I think is awesome because people don't think about this, is we have a little pharmacy, or we have a little, I should say, a supplemental dispensary in our gut in the form of vitamins and other metabolites. Specifically, every single water-soluble vitamin in our body in the form of a B vitamin from B1 all the way to B12 can be generated via microbial synthesis. It likely won't be the same quantity that you get in a supplemental cap, but these bacteria have the ability to generate their own cofactors because every single metabolic reaction that our cells are dependent upon B vitamins for, those take place within the gut themselves. So B vitamins that we take are not just for us. Microbes need them for epigenetic transcription, for the generation of daughter cells, things of that nature. So all of the major B vitamins can be synthesized from our microbes, providing we're feeding our microbes healthy, real food, hopefully that came from nature and not from a package. And as I did mention, and this will be something that we're going to be diving into next month, some of these things, not all of them, because there's more metabolites that we probably haven't uncovered yet that we actually do know of, but some of these things can be measured through different mediums. Organic acids can be measured through urine because acids are typically filtered through the kidneys before they're detoxified through the body in the form of urine loss. And knowledge is power and application is progress, is what I just came up with earlier today. With a better context of understanding these metabolites and where they fit in to the bigger picture of the puzzle that is us, we can get a greater understanding of what may be going on in the gut and how we can relate patterns to what our clients may be experiencing symptomatically in relation to the results that they present on their tests. So when you're looking at DHPPA or 2-hydroxyphenylacetic acid and things of that nature, what you're really doing is you're measuring the postbiotic evidence of these metabolites being present. And if their ratios are extremely high, it gives us an indication of what may be going on, under the hood, so to speak, within the actual metabolic actions in the gut. On the side of stool testing, you can look at products of protein and fat breakdown to get indications from the digestive system, but you can also look at immune modulating molecules, and from a metabolic perspective, you can look at things like total short chain fatty acid levels and the ratio splits between butyrate, acetate, and propionate, with the one caveat saying that whatever you're measuring in a stool sample might not actually be the same profile of what's being generated and utilized by the microbiome itself, but it will give indications, especially if someone's suffering from a inflammatory type disorder. Seeing low levels of short chain fatty acids or low levels of butyrate may give you indications of some changes you might want to make, knowing that the recipe for butyrate is really diet plus probiotics plus prebiotics and optimal breakdown. So I gave everyone a little summary page here, and I'm sure that The amount of information that I have inundated you with today probably isn't necessary to be reiterated, but this is a takeaway that I want you to all have because, as per usual, we do send these slides out. But I hope by this point you understand not only what a postbiotic is from a categorical perspective, it is both a bacterial metabolite, but it's also elements of the microbes and the microbe DNA and the cellular material themselves. And a postbiotic is really dependent upon a probiotic and a prebiotic being present so the metabolization of those happens to generate these variable metabolite outcomes that are all meant to induce optimal changes within the different systems of our body. The immune system is dependent upon them. The metabolic processes of the gut, but also our metabolism as a whole can be influenced by them. They have an incredible ability to protect our guts from potential infectious agents and pathogens, and they also contribute to our total metabolic and micronutrient load. Postbiotic molecules are likely very easily influenced by the changes that we make within our diet and our lifestyles. They can be easily influenced likely by starting to supplement with probiotics on a regular basis, as they can be with prebiotics. And although we don't know what an optimal milieu of postbiotics are, I would likely hazard that if someone is experiencing optimal digestive and absorptive breakdown, a lack of symptoms in their gut, they feel good, they look good, they're in a healthy body composition, they sleep well, and they're active, that what's going on in their gut is probably a really good situation for them as an individual. And when it comes to creating postbiotics, well, everything that we always talk about still holds relevance. The food choices you make, the lifestyle choices you make, the activity that you do or don't get, the stress management that you do and you don't implement, the sleep quality that you do or you don't get. All of these things, believe it or not, are going to play a role because in the human body, everything does affect everything. It is a system-wide organism where one thing, to some degree, lesser or greater, will affect all things. These are some incredible research journals that I've included. So if you want to learn more about this, I encourage you all to dive in deeper. I learned some incredible things from these, and I will be reading them again. It goes into all aspects of postbiotics, the functionalities, the systemic influence, the history of them, the various aspects of how they influence the immune system, which I think is probably the most clinically relevant. So I encourage all of you, dive into postbiotics and brush up before we get into next month's topic. And with that, that's all, folks. Thank you all for being here for the first one of 2025. I wanted to step it up again this year, something that Jeff and I spoke about. I want to continue trying to lead from an educational perspective and providing value for everyone here. And I want to thank you all for being present and for continuing to support the company.